The incomplete grave. Working as a grave digger was my first steady job. It may not be the most traditional job, but I quickly got used to the solitude and the silence. For me, the cemetery was almost a refuge, away from the noise and chaos of the city. The peace of the place attracted me. My older coworkers, however, didn't share the same view. They laughed at me, calling me the naive newbie, suggesting I'd soon quit. I found their comments amusing, but over time, I noticed something in their expressions, a certain unease that hinted they weren't just joking. Still, I brushed it off. To me, the cemetery was just a place to work. My first week was quiet, nothing unusual. I spent my time tending to graves, clearing dry leaves, and occasionally digging. The work was simple, even pleasant. But then came that night, a night that seems to grow longer each time I recall it. I was running late, and the sun had already dipped below the horizon. I wore a headlamp to light my path as I made my way to the area where I needed to dig a new grave. An elderly man had passed away, and his family wanted the burial the following day. The job was mine. The wind whistled through the trees, making shadows dance over the headstones and across the grass. There was an unusual chill, as if the air held something more than just the night breeze. As I dug, I noticed the ground was strangely resistant, almost as if something was blocking it from loosening. For a moment, I thought of leaving the rest of the job for the next day. But my pride got the better of me. I didn't want to give my coworkers more reason to call me lazy newbie, so I kept digging harder. Then the shovel hit something solid, producing a dull, hollow sound. I thought it might be a root or stone, but the noise was strange, empty. I soon realized it was neither. Intrigued, I began digging around it, uncovering the object bit by bit until I saw it was a small wooden box. It looked old, as though it had been buried there for a long time. To my surprise, it was wrapped in rusted chains, as if whoever buried it wanted to ensure it would never be opened. The chill intensified. Part of me knew I should stop. Maybe it was what some call a sixth sense. But at the same time, curiosity drove me forward. That box was there for a reason, and I needed to find out what was inside. With a hammer I carried with me, I began hitting the rusted chains. They broke apart after a few strikes, releasing a strange smell of mold mixed with something else, something unbearable. When the last chain fell away, I lifted the lid. Inside, I found an old porcelain doll. It was covered with a faded cloth, and the smell was nearly overpowering. But it wasn't an ordinary doll. The face was scratched, its large, vacant eyes seemed to watch me, and strands of human hair were sewn into its scalp. This looked like some kind of ritual, an attempt to create something dark. My stomach turned, but somehow, I kept staring. Every detail of the doll was more disturbing than the last. Its hands were skeletal, with nails painted in faded red, as if dried blood had been used. A sense of dread filled me, freezing me in place as my mind grasped the possibility that this doll might have been used for some ancient, dangerous spell. As I stared at the horror before me, the wind died completely. The cemetery, once quiet, grew even heavier. That's when I heard it, a whisper barely audible, coming from all directions. It wasn't just one voice, but a mixture of several, all murmuring something I couldn't decipher. My first reaction was to close the box and bury it again, but my hands were frozen, trembling too much to move. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if something wanted to stop me from acting. Forcing my body to move, I slammed the lid shut and tossed the box back into the grave. Each shovelful of dirt I threw over the box made the whispers intensify, turning into a plea. It was as if the very cemetery was begging me to stop. But I knew I had to finish. I threw the last shovelful of earth and finally stood up, feeling a weight lift from my chest. But something was still wrong. The feeling of being watched intensified, and every shadow around me seemed to shift. I walked toward the exit, feeling cold sweat run down my face. The darkness was denser, and the headstones seemed to tilt, creating a narrowing path, as if they wanted to trap me there. When I finally reached the cemetery gate, I turned briefly, almost out of breath, and saw something that still haunts me. Far in the distance, at the grave I had just filled, a shadow was moving, slow and deliberate. It was an indistinct figure, shrouded in darkness, seeming to rise from the ground and watching me from afar. I ran without looking back, heart pounding. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't sleep. The figure, the doll, the whispers, they all seemed to follow me, echoing in my mind. I told no one. I knew if I mentioned it, I'd be laughed at. But the fear I felt was nothing to joke about. Since that night, every time I pass that area of the cemetery, I feel a chill. Sometimes, in the quietest moments, I hear those same whispers echoing, calling me back, as if that doll, or whatever was tied to it, is still waiting for our reunion. The broken tombstone. For as long as I can remember, I've always enjoyed working, especially with stone. There's something therapeutic about restoring what time or neglect had worn away. So when I was offered a restoration job at Hilltop Cemetery, I accepted right away. It was solitary work, exactly how I liked it. The silence, the shadows cast by tall trees, and the rhythmic sound of my trowel scraping moss off tombstones brought me a peace that few understood. One week, I was called to restore a gravestone in a more isolated section, far from the others. No one seemed to have visited that part of the cemetery in a long time. When I arrived, I noticed this gravestone was different. It was split in two, cracked, as if something had broken it from the inside out, a rare sight, even in a cemetery. The two halves were almost swallowed by the earth, covered in a thick layer of moss and dirt. As I approached, I felt a subtle shift in the air, a strange tension, as if someone were watching me. I looked around, but there was no one, only the deserted, silent cemetery. I brushed off the unease and started my work. The gravestone seemed older than any of the others in that area. The name was almost entirely erased, faded by time and erosion. With some effort, I managed to make out a few letters, but the date was illegible, and the inscription at the base was corroded, as if time itself had purposely erased its words. I found it strange, but I carried on. As I cleaned the cracks, something caught my eye. Beneath the layers of grime, there were carved symbols on the stone, delicate and intricate, as if someone had deliberately tried to hide them. These weren't typical symbols for a gravestone. They didn't look Christian or from any belief I knew. The more I examined them, the more a growing sense of unease crept over me. Time passed quickly as I focused on my work, and before I realized it, the sun was setting. The faint twilight blanketed the cemetery, and the silence felt heavier. The wind picked up suddenly, sending a chill through me. That's when I heard the sound for the first time. It was soft, a low whisper seeming to come from the direction of the gravestone. I looked around, expecting to see someone, but the cemetery was empty. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind through the trees, but the sound persisted, growing clearer. It sounded like a voice, or rather, several voices, all whispering at once, a confused and distorted melody. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but the feeling was unmistakable. Something or someone was trying to communicate. I decided it was time to leave. I gathered my tools and started to walk away from the gravestone, but then I felt a faint vibration under my feet. The ground seemed to tremble slightly, as if something below was moving. I froze, my heart racing. I looked back, and the broken gravestone was still there, split in half, but the air around it felt dense. Against my better instincts, I took a few steps back, approaching the gravestone again. The whispers were louder, almost calling me. On impulse, I knelt down, trying to get a closer look at the mysterious symbols etched into the stone. That's when one of the halves of the gravestone started to move, tilting slowly, as if something were pushing from beneath. My heart pounded. Stones don't move on their own. Then I heard a low but unmistakable sound, the scraping of something under the ground, as if it were trying to escape. The earth around the gravestone trembled slightly, and the sound of shifting dirt echoed in the silence. I took a few steps back, keeping my eyes fixed on the gravestone, and then I saw it. A hand, pale, deformed, slowly emerging from the ground beside the gravestone. I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. The hand moved, the twisted fingers scratching the soil, as if searching for something to grasp. All around, the sound of earth being displaced grew louder as more of the arm began to surface. My mind screamed for me to run, but my body was paralyzed with fear. And then a cold, soft voice echoed in my mind. "Help me," it whispered. "I'm trapped here." Finally, I managed to move. I ran, leaving my tools behind, my heart pounding as if it would burst. I didn't know what that thing was or why it was happening, but one thing was clear: that gravestone should never have been disturbed. The next day, I returned to the cemetery under the guise of retrieving my tools, but I avoided looking toward that isolated corner. Yet something inside me forced me to check. As I approached the area, I felt a strange chill. The gravestone was there, just as I'd left it, split in two, covered in a thick layer of moss. It looked untouched, as if no one had touched it in decades. The voices I'd heard, the hand emerging from the earth, it all seemed like a nightmare. But I knew it was real. Something in that ground was alive and trapped. Since then, I've never accepted any jobs restoring old gravestones, especially those far from the others. I learned that some things are better left forgotten, buried, and undisturbed. Even now, if I pass near that area of the cemetery, I feel a presence, as if something or someone is still down there waiting. The bell that didn't ring. Working as a night watchman at San Miguel's cemetery always seemed strange to others. But for me, the silence and solitude of the cemetery brought a rare peace. The darkness became familiar, and walking among tombstones under the stars, listening only to the rustling leaves, became almost comforting. Over time, that place became like a second home. Every corner and detail of the cemetery grew as familiar as the lines on my own hand. But there was one thing that always unsettled me: the bell tower at the center of the cemetery. The old stone structure had stood since the cemetery's founding, housing an ancient bell known to be broken for decades. No one bothered to use it, and they said no one had bothered to repair it. The bell remained there, mute and lifeless. Sometimes, on my rounds, I'd avoid going too close to the tower, especially on nights when the wind blew colder and the silence felt heavier. On those nights, the air around the bell seemed laden with something invisible, something I couldn't explain. There was a weight there, a presence that I could only sense but never see. One winter night, when the cold was especially intense, everything changed. A thick fog covered the cemetery, and I made my way around with the beam of my flashlight lighting the path. The sound of my footsteps was muffled by the damp grass, and the air around me felt heavier than usual. As I neared the tower, the light breeze suddenly stopped, and an absolute silence filled the air. Then I heard it. Ding! A soft, almost whispered sound, but unmistakable. I froze, my heart pounding. It was the bell no one had heard in decades. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself it was my imagination, but the sound came again, a little louder this time, reverberating through the tombstones and echoing across the empty cemetery. The bell, with its deep, melancholy tone, seemed to be calling, urging me to come closer. Part of me hesitated, but at the same time, I felt compelled to investigate. Clutching the flashlight tightly, I approached the tower, the sound still echoing intermittently, as if something were desperately trying to ring the bell. When I reached the base of the staircase, the sound abruptly stopped. I decided to climb. My hands were shaking, and each step creaked ominously. As I ascended, the air grew colder, and a sense of unease spread through me. When I finally reached the top and opened the door to the tower, a gust of cold wind wrapped around me. Inside, the darkness was absolute, broken only by the flickering light of my flashlight. I looked at the bell, expecting to see it moving, but it was absolutely still, just as it had always been. I approached, my heavy breathing filling the space. Then I noticed something strange. Names were carved into the stone walls of the tower, too many to count. They were the names of people buried in the cemetery, dating back decades, even centuries. My eyes scanned the names until I stopped at a specific spot. There, etched into the stone, was my name, Luis. Just like the others, marked with a chilling precision, as if it had always been there waiting for me. Fear spread through me, growing in a way I'd never felt before. I sensed I was no longer alone, that something in the tower was alive and aware of my presence. Heart pounding, I began to back away, eager to escape. But as I turned to descend the stairs, the bell tolled one last time, a deep, resonant sound that reverberated within me. The sound froze me for a moment, and then I found myself running down the spiral staircase, each step seeming longer than the last, as if the tower stretched endlessly. When I finally reached the ground and exited the tower, the cemetery was completely silent again. A dense, suffocating silence. I ran, feeling that something invisible and dark was following me, watching as I fled. The sensation of being pursued was so intense that even when I reached home, I looked over my shoulder, expecting to see a shadow watching me from the doorway. The next morning, I returned to the cemetery under the pretense of a daytime inspection. I looked at the tower. It was as it always was, silent and imposing. But now every time I pass by, I feel something different. As if the bell is waiting for the right moment to ring again, waiting for another name, perhaps. And even though the bell has never rung again, while someone was there to hear it, I feel that its last toll, the one I heard that night, will never be forgotten. Whispers in the Crypt. Since I was young, I've always had a deep connection with history, especially with old places that carry marks of the past. Working as a restorer of crypts and funerary monuments was, for me, more than a profession. It was a way to keep alive the memory of those who came before us. I was never superstitious or prone to believe in ghost stories. To me, cemeteries were places of peace and reflection. When I was offered the job of restoring the crypt of the Morera family, I saw it as a unique opportunity. The family had an important legacy in the city, but the crypt had been abandoned for decades, situated in the most remote and forgotten corner of Monte Esperanza Cemetery. Built in a neo-Gothic style, it was majestic despite its neglect. The stone statues of angels were covered in moss, and the grand iron door was rusted and sealed with ancient chains. The day I began the work, the sky was overcast with heavy clouds, and a thin mist blanketed the cemetery. As I approached the crypt, I felt a subtle change in the air, as if the temperature had dropped a few degrees. I ignored the sensation and began carefully removing the chains. Each broken link emitted a sharp sound that echoed through the silence. When I finally opened the door, it creaked in a way that revealed the deep darkness within. I switched on my flashlight and stepped inside. The interior of the crypt was stunning. There were stained glass windows on the walls, though most were broken, allowing pale beams of light to spill in irregularly. The corridors were adorned with intricate sculptures and inscriptions in Latin. As I walked, I felt as if the empty-eyed statues were watching me. I started cleaning, brushing away cobwebs and years of dust. Passing by a row of niches, I noticed some were empty while others held ancient coffins. One of them caught my attention, a dark wooden coffin, richly decorated but showing signs of being disturbed. The lid was ajar, and scratch marks covered the surface. A chill ran through me, but I forced myself to keep going. As I continued, my flashlight began flickering, flashing sporadically. I tapped it lightly, trying to get it to work properly. That's when I heard a distant sound, a faint murmur, almost imperceptible. It seemed to come from the depths of the crypt. I stopped to listen, but the sound vanished. Convinced it was just the wind slipping through a crack, I resumed my work. I reached a large chamber at the back of the crypt. In the center was a stone sarcophagus, different from the other tombs I had seen. The walls were covered with inscriptions that seemed to narrate the history of the Morera family, but parts were scratched out or erased, as if someone had tried to remove certain details. My curiosity led me to examine the sarcophagus more closely. As I cleaned its surface, I noticed symbols I didn't recognize mixed with the Latin inscriptions. I took photos with my phone to research later. Suddenly, a cold draft swept over me, and the chamber door slammed shut with a loud bang. I ran to the door, but it was locked. My heart raced as I tried to calm myself, thinking it must have been an air current. Then, I heard the murmuring again, louder this time. It was a chorus of whispered voices, as if multiple people were speaking at once, but I couldn't make out the words. My flashlight flickered once more and then died completely, leaving me in total darkness. Panic began to set in. I tried turning on my phone's flashlight, but its battery was inexplicably dead. In the silence, the whispers grew louder. The voices seemed to surround me, coming from all directions. I reached out, feeling along the walls for any sign of a switch or a way out, but my fingers touched something wet and sticky. I brought my hand to my nose and smelled blood. A visceral fear seized me. The voices now formed a kind of chant, a sinister melody that echoed through the chamber. I sensed a presence behind me. Slowly, I turned, and in the darkness, I saw misty shapes beginning to materialize. Human silhouettes, but distorted, like shadows cast by a flickering flame. They moved slowly toward me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figures raised ethereal arms, pointing at me. One of them whispered directly into my ear, cold and clear, "You shouldn't be here." The phrase echoed in my mind, breaking my paralysis. Summoning all the courage I had left, I bolted for the door, pounding on it desperately. To my surprise, the door opened easily. I stumbled out of the chamber and ran through the darkened corridors, not caring which way I went. The voices echoed behind me, more agitated now. I tripped over rubble and nearly fell, but I kept running. Finally, I saw the faint light coming from the crypt's entrance. As I emerged outside, the fresh air filled my lungs. The mist had lifted, and the sun was beginning to break through the clouds. I looked back, expecting to see something at the entrance, but there was nothing. The door was open, just as I'd left it. I quickly gathered my tools and left the cemetery. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I analyzed the photos I'd taken, but the symbols didn't appear in them. The images were blurred, as if something had interfered with the camera. I decided not to return to the crypt. I informed the family that the work was complete, omitting the details of what had occurred. But since then, something within me has changed. At night, in my dreams, I still hear the whispers and see the dark silhouettes approaching. And I always wake up with the feeling that I am not alone. If you love mysteries and the supernatural, subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Leave a like to support the work and share with friends who are into the supernatural. Your engagement keeps these secrets alive.